In this third video, in the Introduction to Market Structures lesson, we'll be covering monopoly, what it means and how a business remains a monopoly. And you can see here that monopoly is at the opposite end of the spectrum from the structure that we covered in the second video, which was perfect competition. And again, you would be thinking about market power, barriers to entry, efficiency and contestability in those different markets. Now, the first important point to note here is that there are different interpretations or different meanings of monopoly, and all of them are equally valid. So it's important that you learn these different approaches or different definitions of monopoly and think about which one you want to apply. So looking along the top row here, what a monopoly is. A pure monopolist is when you've got a single seller, just one seller in a market for a good or service. But then there's a broader definition moving along to the right. In the UK, the CMA, now that stands for Competition and Markets Authority, defines a working monopoly or an effective monopoly as any firm that has a market share which is greater than 25%. So that obviously means they're not necessarily the single seller, because part of the market share goes to other businesses in the market, but they have at least 25% share of the market. And then a further variation is that a dominant firm has at least a 40% market share. So different ways of interpreting monopoly, and it's important to note that that those different interpretations exist. What's common for all of them is that and this is relevant to all types of monopoly, the market demand curve is the same as the monopolist's demand curve. So that will show us what consumers in the market are willing and able to pay. What that doesn't mean is that the monopolist can charge any price that they want. Because if you think about the demand curve, if you try to charge a price which is above the demand curve, then you'll have excess supply. So they're limited in the price that they can charge, but limited by the market demand curve. And that means that they are a price maker. Okay, they can determine where on the demand curve they want to set their price. Sixth point here, there are high barriers to both entry and exit. These stop new competitors coming in, and we'll have a look at barriers to entry in a bit more detail in a moment. And then finally, they're profit maximizers. That's how they'll decide how much to produce and the price that they want to charge. So we tend to assume, or we always assume, unless told otherwise, that a monopolist is a profit maximizer. Okay, so I said that we would have a look at barriers to entry in a bit more detail. Here we're going to consider how a firm can get monopoly power as a result of those barriers to entry. What the purpose of the barriers to entry are to prevent other firms entering the market, taking away their market share, and that protects the incumbent's dominant position. And the term incumbent refers to a firm that's already there in the market and has that monopoly position. So here are some examples. The first one might be legal barriers. For example, there might be patents that a business has that gives it exclusive legal right to use a particular design of a product. Businesses have economies of scale, and that means that they can operate on a lower level of costs per item produced than a new entrant that's coming in with a lower level of output. Very often businesses seek to establish brand loyalty so that customers always want to keep coming back to them, and even if a new business enters the market, customers will be reluctant to move away. They also seek to establish some control over the technology that they use, the resources, the factors of production that they use. And they might do that through vertical integration. If you've already studied integration, you'll know that what this means is a business merging with or buying, taking over either one of its suppliers, if it's backwards vertical integration, or one of its distributors, if it's forwards vertical integration. And finally, they might well have a significant amount of capital, plenty of money in the bank, and lots of expertise or human capital amongst their staff. And that, again, gives them a barrier to entry, makes it difficult for others to come in and compete. So here there's an activity or an exercise for you to practice thinking about how those barriers to entry apply to different industries. 3 industries for you here. Airlines, so you might think about people like Virgin Atlantic or British Airways. Cinemas, you might think about a business like the Odeon or View Cinemas. Pharmaceuticals, we'd be thinking about manufacturers like GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, or AstraZeneca. Your task is to think about what kind of barriers to entry exist in each of those industries. So pause the video, either using your worksheet or a separate piece of paper, note down what you think the barriers to entry might be for each of those 3, and then restart the video when you're ready. So here are suggestions of some of the barriers that you might have considered. Firstly, let's think about airlines. Well, brand loyalty is often the case with airlines, particularly if people are gaining air miles with the airline that they commonly travel with. It might be to do with the cost of renting takeoff and landing slots, which is a very expensive part of an airline's operating costs. Or it might be more sort of earlier in the business, the actual capital outlay of buying the planes in the first place. You might have other ideas there. In terms of cinemas, reputation could well be a significant barrier to entry. If the Odeon tends to be almost synonymous with going to the cinema as one of the biggest brands in the market. You might also consider the cost of the technology, the digital platform for showing films, and the access to that technology and to the films themselves. You might think about the economies of scale for a big chain of cinemas with dozens of cinemas around the country. That will significantly reduce the average cost that they have per screening of a film compared with an independent cinema that may only have a small number of outlets or branches around the place. And then finally, the pharmaceutical industry. You might think about demand being pretty price inelastic and very large fixed costs. So it's very difficult for somebody else to set up the laboratories, the distribution networks, the research and development that they need in order to get into the pharmaceutical research and development and selling industry. And then finally, in terms of legal barriers, the need for regulatory approval. You can't just make a drug and start selling it without it being tested and approved for use in the market by government authorities first. So now we're going to look at a different market, the market for browsers, use of browsers in computing in the UK. May 2019 to May 2020, and we're going to just practice the quantitative skills that you have to be able to show as an economist. So the data that you've got here shows a variety of different suppliers, firms in the browser market. And the question is, how would you describe the pattern that's shown in this data? Well, there should be one point that immediately sticks out, is that there is one very dominant firm with roughly 50% of the market, and that's Chrome. So they clearly have a market dominant position. But then there is a second one as well that's got more than 25%, and you might remember that was the Competition and Markets Authority's definition of when a firm has market power, and that's the Apple system that's called Safari. And then finally, we've got quite a large number of other suppliers, but all with a very low market share of between 0 and 5%. So finally, here's a research task for you to go a bit deeper into this particular market, the market for browsers. There have been a lot of news stories regarding the power of the tech companies over the last few years and the influence that they have over the way that we use the internet and our computing. So your task here is to carry out some more research into whether Google can be considered a monopolist with that Chrome browser. So you've got the previous graphic, but what are the positive and negative impacts on consumers and competitors of Google's position? That's some work for you to carry out independently, and then you might want to, when you've completed it, to send it through to your teacher for some comments and feedback. So that brings us to the end of the second video, or the second market structure that we're looking at, monopoly. And in the next one, we'll be looking at a different market structure, which is called monopolistic competition.